The smell hit Corporal Darren Voss first, smoke and wet stone and something older underneath, something mineral and ancient, like iron left in rain. He'd been stationed at Checkpoint Vale 9 for 11 months, long enough to learn that the Ironblood Orcs smelled like their name, like a forge that never went cold. The girl didn't smell like any of that. She smelled like ash. She was wedged behind a collapsed section of processing wall in Sector 4, the part of the checkpoint that had taken the worst of the Conclave bombardment 3 days prior. The whole North Corridor had been condemned, yellow-striped with hazard tape that nobody had bothered to put up properly, because nobody had enough personnel left to bother. Voss only found her because he'd gone back to look for his field knife, which he'd left during the last casualty sweep. She was no bigger than a human child of maybe 8 or 9, but her bone structure said otherwise. The ridge of brow, the density of her frame, the way her hands curled even in unconsciousness into something that could have cracked stone. Her skin was the deep burnished gray of her people, and her upper canines were already coming in longer than normal, which meant she was older than she looked. Ironblood young developed differently than human children. They ran small until about their 10th year, then grew fast and sudden, like a blade being unsheathed. She had a brand on her left wrist. Voss had seen the sigil once before, in a briefing packet that nobody was supposed to have read, that had arrived encrypted and then been quietly burned by command 3 hours after distribution. He remembered it because he had a memory for symbols, the same way some people had an ear for languages. The sigil was a double helix of interconnected chain links, each link bearing a tiny hammer. The Ironblood called it the Urdes, the birthmark of the bloodline that had ruled the Orc clans for 4,000 years. He stood there in the rubble of Sector 4 and stared at an unconscious child who was either a refugee or the most wanted living being in the Conclave-controlled sector of the galaxy. And he did the calculation that his entire life had been building toward without him knowing it. He picked her up. She weighed less than he expected. His name was on no important lists. That was the first advantage. Corporal Darren Voss, attached to the 114th Mixed Integration Unit, was the kind of soldier that command forgot about between assignments. Not because he was incompetent, his record was clean, his efficiency rating solid, but because he operated in the negative space of military bureaucracy. He processed intake forms. He filed interdiction reports. He sat at the checkpoint desk for 14 hours a day and processed the documentation for alien civilians attempting to cross from Conclave-occupied territory into the neutral buffer zone. And he did it so quietly and so consistently that he had become functionally invisible to every supervisor above the rank of lieutenant colonel. The second advantage was the condemned sector itself. The bombardment had taken out not just the wall but the surveillance cluster mounted on it. 3 drones were down. The replacement order was in, he'd seen it, had in fact processed the requisition paperwork himself, but the estimated arrival was 6 weeks out. The Conclave didn't bomb checkpoints randomly. They bombed infrastructure to degrade documentation capacity, to slow the processing of refugee crossings, to create the kind of administrative chaos that let their hunters move through the net while everyone was focused on the holes. Ironic, then, that the same bombing had created the only safe space in Checkpoint Vale 9 where a child could be hidden. He gave her water from his kit. He cleaned the wound on her left shoulder, a shallow slash from something edged, almost certainly a blade with the last of his wound seal spray. He wrapped her in his spare thermal layer and sat with his back against the rubble and thought about what he'd just done and what it would require him to do next. The Conclave's Orc pacification mandate had been issued 4 months ago. The language was careful, bureaucratic, the sort of language that gets inserted into official records so that nobody later has to say the word extermination. Voss had processed the mandate's certification paperwork himself. He'd stamped it and filed it and gone home and eaten a meal he couldn't taste, and then he'd reported for duty the next morning because there was nothing else to do. The last of the Ironblood royal lineage had reportedly been killed at the siege of Cared Vel. That was the official conclave position, filed with the Interplanetary Arbitration Bureau and confirmed by 3 independent witnesses, whose names Voss suspected had been provided by the conclave itself. If even one member of the royal bloodline survived, the Ironblood clans had a legal and cultural right, backed by 4,000 years of precedent, to reconvene under their sovereign banner and resist the mandate on grounds of ethnic annihilation. The conclave knew this, which was why they'd been so thorough at Cared Vel. Not thorough enough. The girl's eyes opened around hour 2. They were gold, not the pale amber common among lower Ironblood clans, but deep, hammered gold, the color of metal that's been worked and reworked until all impurity is burned out. She looked at him with those eyes and said nothing for a very long time. He said, in the 4 words of Ironblood he'd picked up from 11 months of intake processing, "You are safe here." Her eyes moved to the thermal wrap around her, to the wound seal on her shoulder, to the water container he'd left within reach. She said in accented but clear standard, "No, I'm not." He almost smiled. "No," he agreed, "not really, but I'm working on it." Her name, she told him after another long silence, was Myrth. She was the last daughter of the house Urdes. She was 9 years old by human reckoning, which meant she was, by Ironblood reckoning, approximately equivalent to a human of 13, old enough to understand exactly what had been done to her family. Old enough to have run 300 kilometers on foot through conclave-occupied territory after the fall of Cared Vel, eating whatever she could find, sleeping in drainage channels and maintenance crawlways, because someone, she didn't know who, she'd never seen their face, had told her before the siege that if the worst happened, she had to reach the neutral buffer zone. She had been 12 hours from the boundary when the bombardment caught her in the wrong sector. Voss listened to all of it without interrupting. When she was done, he said, "Okay, here's what we need to do." The problem with checkpoint bureaucracy was that it was airtight in the wrong direction. Getting someone out required paperwork. Crossing documentation, identity verification, zone transfer authorization, all of it had to go through the system, which meant it was all visible, flagged, trackable. The conclave didn't run the checkpoint directly, but they had 3 liaison officers embedded in the processing wing, and they had access to every record filed. Getting someone in, though, that was a different architecture. Voss had spent 11 months watching people arrive, watching how the system handled its own failures, its own gaps. The checkpoint had been built for a pre-war throughput of about 2,000 crossings a day. It was currently handling between 8 and 12,000, mostly displaced Ironblood and their dependent species, all of them running from a mandate that the Arbitration Bureau hadn't yet formally classified as what it was. The system wasn't designed for this load. It was bending in very specific places. One of those places was the Emergency Displaced Person Intake category, code EDP-7, which had been created in a crisis 3 years prior and had never been properly decommissioned. An EDP-7 intake could be processed by a single checkpoint officer under field conditions with reduced documentation requirements, stamped directly into the Emergency Housing Registry. And this was the part that mattered, would not appear in the main crossing ledger for 48 hours, while the system queued the secondary verification. 48 hours was a long time. Voss pulled up his terminal in the condemned sector, running it off a portable power cell he'd appropriated from the supply closet, with paperwork he'd filed so routinely that nobody would cross-reference it for weeks. He pulled up the EDP-7 intake form and started filling it in. Name Myrth, just Myrth. Field stripped of lineage designation, which was technically proper under the emergency intake protocol, which had its own obscure clause about protecting displaced minors from identity-based targeting. Species Ironblood Orc, subtype unspecified. Again, technically proper. Most intake officers just wrote Orc, which was imprecise but acceptable under the field condition variants. Age, estimated juvenile. This was where it got interesting. The EDP7 form's age field had a known system bug. Voss had actually filed a correction request about it 8 months ago, which had been acknowledged and not addressed, where estimated juvenile entries below a certain threshold would flag the record for social services review rather than security review. The review queue for social services was currently 47 days long. He filled in the form with the careful, practiced hand of a man who had spent 11 months learning exactly how much weight each field carried. Myrth sat on a piece of rubble watching him work. "What are you doing?" "Making you boring," he said. She looked at the form on his screen. She read standard well enough to follow most of it. After a moment she said, "That's not my name. That's not any of my names." "I know. My name is Myrth Urdes, 42nd of her line, daughter of High Sovereign Kareth and Shield Mother Ivris, blood-bound heir to." "I know who you are," he said quietly. "But right now, the most dangerous thing about you is your name. So for 48 hours, your name is Myrth, estimated juvenile, no lineage designation." She went quiet then, and after 48 hours. "We figure out the next 48 hours. The Conclave liaison officers were named Preth, Valdas 7, and Commander Enoch. Preth was the one Voss feared least and had to deal with most. A mid-grade Conclave bureaucrat of the Velen species, all narrow shoulders and clicking mandibles, obsessed with cross-referencing documentation anomalies in a way that was professionally admirable and personally terrifying. Preth had flagged 4 crossings in the last month that other officers had waved through. 3 had been Ironblood using altered identity documents. 1 had been a human aid worker carrying communications equipment not declared on intake. All 4 had been correct calls. Preth stopped by Voss's processing desk at hour 6. "You have been working the condemned sector again," Preth said. "Not accusatory, observational." "Lost my field knife in the last casualty sweep," Voss said. He held it up. "Found it." Preth's mandibles clicked twice in what Voss had learned was the Velen equivalent of a mildly satisfied sound. "You should request reassignment from condemned sector casualty work. The structural integrity reports are incomplete." "I'll put in the request," Voss said. He did, in fact, put in the request. He filed it through the proper form, which would sit in his supervisor's queue for approximately 3 days. In the meantime, his access to condemned Sector 4 remained technically valid. Valdas 7 was the Conclave liaison he feared most and dealt with least, which was its own kind of anxiety. Valdas 7 was a synthesis unit, not quite AI, not quite organic, a Conclave-designed intelligence that ran on distributed hardware and had no physical form beyond a terminal interface. It processed approximately 40,000 data points per hour and was assigned to cross-referencing refugee intake records against the Conclave's missing persons and priority target lists. Voss had watched Valdas 7 flag an Ironblood Elder for secondary screening based on a 17-pixel facial reconstruction match from a photograph taken 6 years prior. The EDP7 form, critically, fell outside Valdas 7 primary monitoring queue because of the 48-hour ledger delay. But that didn't mean invisible. It meant delayed. 48 hours from now, the form would surface, and Valdas 7 would process it, and Voss needed Myrth to be somewhere that wasn't a condemned sector in a checkpoint when that happened. Commander Enoch was the one he couldn't read. Tall for a Conclave species, nearly 2 meters, with the layered body plating of the Drath, and quiet in a way that felt intentional, like volume was something Enoch had decided long ago was unnecessary. Enoch walked the checkpoint twice a day at irregular intervals and said almost nothing to anyone, just observed. In 11 months, Voss had received exactly 4 direct statements from Enoch, all of them operational, none of them unkind. He didn't know what Enoch believed. He didn't know if Enoch had opinions about the mandate. He didn't know if, somewhere behind that layered plating and those dark compound eyes, there was something that would look at a 9-year-old girl and see either a target or a child. He was not interested in finding out. The Neutral Buffer Zone's Emergency Housing Registry was run by a species called the Threnny, 3-armed and patient, and relentlessly committed to documentation in a way that matched Voss's own bureaucratic instincts, and therefore felt, to him, like the closest thing to trustworthy he was going to find in a war zone. The Threnny processing officer on duty at the registry intake was named Isev, and Voss had processed her daughter's crossing paperwork 6 weeks ago, and he had done it efficiently and without condescension, which apparently mattered more than he'd realized because Isev, when she saw his name on the incoming EDP-7 form, had flagged it for her own personal attention queue rather than routing it through standard processing. He found out about this when his terminal pinged at hour 14. The message from Isev read, "Your intake is interesting. The lineage field anomaly is consistent with field condition variance, but the bone density estimate on the attached medical intake form is inconsistent with the age estimate you filed. Ironblood juvenile development is not my specialty. I have routed your intake to our specialist. Please advise on transport timeline." Voss stared at the message for a moment. Then he typed back, "Transport can occur within 4 hours. Please advise on specialist." The response came in 11 minutes. The specialist's name was Dr. Orath. She was an Ironblood herself, one of the tens of thousands who had crossed before the mandate, who were now living in the buffer zone in a kind of suspended grief, watching their people be systematically erased across the boundary. Dr. Orath had been providing medical intake support to the Refugee Registry for 3 months. She had security clearance from the Threnny Authority. She had no connection to the Conclave database. She was also, Isev's message noted in what felt to Voss like very careful understatement, someone who had been asking for a long time whether there were any survivors from Carad Vel. Voss sat back in the folding chair he dragged into the condemned sector and looked at Meyerth, who had fallen asleep again, curled tight against the thermal layer, one fist pressed to her chest in a gesture that looked like it had been worn into her body by something she'd done 10,000 times before. He typed 4 hours, thank you. Then he got up and started thinking about the crossing. Getting Meyerth from the condemned sector to the civilian crossing queue without her being scanned, logged, or visually identified by Valdas 7 monitoring system required solving approximately 6 separate problems simultaneously, which was the kind of challenge that would have broken a better resourced person and simply made Voss tired. Problem 1 was the biometric scanner at the entry to the civilian processing wing. The scanner logged species, estimated age, and a partial genetic trace on all incoming individuals. Partial, not full, which meant it wasn't keyed for lineage-specific markers, but it would absolutely flag an unregistered Ironblood juvenile, which would route her for secondary processing, which meant a human officer and at least one Conclave liaison review. The scanner had a maintenance window every 72 hours. The last window had been 68 hours ago. Voss filed a routine maintenance escalation through the equipment management system, citing sensor drift on the left side projector, an actual known issue he'd noted in a prior report, and requested an immediate partial recalibration, which would take the scanner offline for approximately 20 minutes. The maintenance request went through in 45 minutes. He had a 2-hour lead time. Problem 2 was the visual monitoring grid in the transition corridor. Voss couldn't take it offline without triggering an alert, but he could route himself and Meyer through the corridor during the shift change. when the monitoring room was running minimum staff, and the 2-minute handover gap in active watching was a known but undocumented feature of the duty schedule that every checkpoint officer knew and nobody ever officially acknowledged. Problem 3 was Myrth herself, who had to move through a crowded processing wing and not be recognized. He'd thought about this one for a while. The answer was, in the end, very simple and very old. He dressed her in a full-coverage thermal layer from the medical supply cache, hood drawn up and sealed at the collar, the kind of gear that any juvenile might wear in the post-bombardment cold that had settled into the checkpoint since the heating grid took hits. He put her in a medic-coated transport sling, the kind used for mobile patient transfer, which gave them a formal reason to be moving, a formal destination, and the kind of forward momentum in a checkpoint corridor that people stepped out of the way for instead of looking at too closely. He went over it with her 3 times. "If someone talks to you," he said, "you say nothing, you let me talk. What if they ask me something directly?" Nobody asks the patient in a medical sling a direct question. They ask the transporting officer. She looked at him with those gold eyes. "And if they do?" "Then you say you don't feel well and look at the floor." "I actually don't feel well." "Good, that's useful." She almost smiled. It was the first time he'd seen anything on her face that wasn't watchfulness. It lasted about half a second and then it was gone, pulled back in, and he felt the weight of what it meant that a 9-year-old had learned to hide everything about herself with that completeness. "Hey," he said. She looked at him. "You've been running for 3 weeks. You've been alone for most of that. You made it 300 kilometers through occupied territory at 9 years old." He paused. "You can handle 20 minutes in a corridor." She was quiet for a moment. "Then, who taught you to talk to Ironblood children?" "Nobody. I'm making it up as I go." "That's obvious." "Is it working?" Another almost smile, slightly longer this time. A little. The crossing happened at the shift change, 17 hours after Voss had found her in the rubble. He timed the maintenance window to align with the shift handover within a 4-minute margin, which was the tightest he could get given the constraints of both schedules. He filed the transport documentation under his own officer code, routed through the social services queue, where it would sit for 47 days before anyone looked at it with serious attention, and walked Myrth through the transition corridor with the medic sling and the forward momentum of a man who had somewhere to be. The corridor was crowded. Checkpoint Vale 9 was always crowded now. The refugee flow never fully stopped, just shifted registers between day and night, and the transition period was its own kind of chaos, officers signing out and signing in, civilians bunched in holding queues, the low constant sound of many beings in a small space trying to be patient under conditions that didn't reward patience. Myrth kept her eyes on the floor. He kept his eyes on everything else. At the 2-minute mark he saw Preth at the far end of the corridor, mandibles working, tablet in hand, scanning faces in the queue with the methodical attention that made Preth good at a job Voss deeply respected, and currently wanted very much to be on the other side of. He adjusted his angle by 7 degrees, putting a column between them and kept moving. At the 4-minute mark, he passed within 12 meters of Commander Enoch. He'd always known this was the moment he couldn't plan around. Enoch was impossible to schedule. Enoch moved at irregular intervals. He'd hoped for a gap. He didn't get one. Enoch was standing at the edge of the corridor, watching the queue, and as Voss passed with the medic sling and his patient and his carefully constructed forward momentum, Enoch's head turned. Their eyes met. Voss held Enoch's gaze for exactly as long as he would hold any senior officer's gaze while in mid-transport, present, responsive, not hurrying, not hiding. He gave the small acknowledgement nod that a corporal gives a commander when passing in an operational corridor. He kept walking. He did not look back. At 6 minutes they were through the transition corridor and into the civilian processing wing's far end, which ran directly to the Threni registry intake station. And at 8 minutes Isev was in front of them. And at 8 minutes and 30 seconds a woman was there beside Isev, tall and burnished gray, and with eyes the color of hammered gold. And she looked at Myrth in the medic sling, and her face did something that Voss could not fully read but felt in the center of his chest like a low bell struck once. Dr. Oreth said something in Ironblood that he didn't catch. Myrth said something back in Ironblood that he also didn't catch. And then Myrth's hand came out of the thermal layer and closed around Dr. Oreth's wrist, and neither of them spoke for a long moment, and Voss stood there in the noise and the crowd and breathed. He spent the next 45 minutes back at his desk in the processing wing, filing the shift handover paperwork for the officers rotating out, which was his job, and which he did correctly and without visible distraction. He answered 2 questions from a processing civilian about queue wait times. He countersigned a form that his lieutenant had forgotten to complete. He drank bad coffee from the dispenser in the break area. At hour 19, Preth came to his desk. "Your EDP-7 intake from last cycle," Preth said. "The Ironblood juvenile." Voss's hand stayed still on the keyboard. He had spent 11 months practicing stillness at this desk. "The secondary documentation shows a medical transfer routing to Threni registry." Preth's mandibles worked. "That is unusual. EDP-7 minors don't typically transfer to medical registry intake without a clinical incident flag." "Patient showed signs of hypothermia," Voss said, "and secondary wound care requirements. I rerouted under the field medical transfer provision. It's in the notes." It was in the notes. He had written the notes at hour 15 with exactly this conversation in mind. Preth's mandibles clicked twice, checking something on the tablet. The provision allows for rerouting without supervisor approval in field conditions. A pause. "Your field conditions notation is another pause within standard." "Good," Voss said. Preth did not leave immediately. Voss had learned that Preth's silences were working silences, not social ones. The Velen were processing continuously, and sometimes what looked like hesitation was in fact the final stages of a calculation. "The documentation is correct," Preth said at last, "but your documentation is always correct." Voss looked up. Preth's compound eyes were unreadable in the way that all Velen eyes were unreadable to him, too many facets to map a single emotion onto. "I try to be thorough." "Yes," Preth said, "you do." A pause. "The Threni registry has very good security." It wasn't a question. It wasn't anything technically except a factual statement. "Yes," Voss said, "they do." Preth's mandibles clicked once. Then Preth turned and walked back toward the liaison station. Voss returned to the keyboard. His hands were perfectly still. His heart rate was doing something complicated that he chose not to examine closely. Valdus 7 flagged the EDP-7 form 47 hours and 12 minutes after Voss had filed it. By that time, the form had already been processed through 3 levels of Threni registry intake. A medical assessment had been filed under Dr. Oreth's clinical code, and the case had been assigned to a social services review track that had its own separate security classification and its own separate documentation chain. The flag from Valdus 7 came to Voss's terminal as a routine cross-reference request, protocol, not accusation, asking him to confirm the biometric intake data for the EDP-7 case. The biometric data he had on file was the scanner data from the maintenance window crossing, a partial read genus-level species identification, no lineage markers, consistent with what he'd filed. He confirmed it. The confirmation went back to Valdus 7 as a routine response. Valdus 7 follow-up request came 11 minutes later. It asked for the original field intake photos. Voss had anticipated this. The field intake photos he'd filed were real. He'd taken them in the condemned sector, standard intake procedure, and they showed an Ironblood juvenile in a full-coverage thermal layer, hood sealed, face partially obscured by the hood edge, which was, again, consistent with the cold conditions notation in the medical intake record and consistent with the hypothermia notation in the clinical notes. He filed them. Valdus 7 response was a standard receipt acknowledgement, no further follow-up flag, case status, monitoring, periodic review. He sat with that for a moment. Monitoring, periodic review. Not closed. Valdus 7 didn't close things. But monitoring was different from active investigation, and periodic review meant the next automated flag would come in 30 days, by which point the case would have moved through multiple additional layers of Threnny registry processing, and the original EDP-7 documentation would be buried under 30 days of case notes, none of which Valdus 7 had visibility into. 30 days was a long time. He went to the Threnny registry once, on his next off-cycle, filing the visit through the Checkpoint's Liaison Outreach Program, which was a real program that existed for exactly this purpose, and that nobody used very much. Dr. Oreth met him at the registry entrance. She was as he'd imagined her from Isev's description, solid, measured, with the kind of stillness in her that came not from suppression but from depth, like she had so much to hold that stillness was the only efficient way to carry it. She said, "She asked me to give you something." She held out a small object. He took it. It was a piece of rubble from the condemned sector, smooth gray stone, about the size of his thumb with a mark scratched into it. He recognized the scratching, after a moment, as a character from the Ironblood writing system. He didn't know what it meant. "What does it say?" he asked. "Witness," Dr. Oreth said. "It's not a common word in our formal script. It's an old one. It used to be a legal term. It means someone who saw something important and did not look away." He turned the stone over in his hand. "How is she?" "Eating," Dr. Oreth said. "Sleeping without waking every hour. Yesterday she asked me what happens next, and I told her I didn't know yet, and she said that was a better answer than the one she'd been getting." A pause. "She told me what you did, the forms, the maintenance window, the sling." Dr. Oreth's gold eyes, the same shade as Meyerth's, he noticed, the same hammered depth moved to his face. "She said you told her she could handle 20 minutes in a corridor." "She'd already handled 3 weeks alone in occupied territory," he said. 20 minutes seemed reasonable. "She said you made it up as you went." "I try to be thorough." Dr. Oreth looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "There are people, on this side of the boundary, who have been trying to locate any survivors from the Erd-S line since the siege. People who understand what her survival means. Not just to us, to the legal case. The Arbitration Bureau requires a living sovereign to lodge a formal resistance petition under the Continuity of People statute. If the petition is lodged, the mandate cannot be enforced under treaty law while it's under review." "How long does a petition review take?" "Years," she said. "The Conclave's legal apparatus is very good at delay." "Years is better than what they had a week ago." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Yes, it is." He was almost to the exit when she said his name. He turned. "The Ironblood word for what you did," she said. "The hiding, the forms, the walking through the corridor with your heart in your throat, there's a word for that too." "What is it?" "Gret Kale," she said. "It means the thing a person does when they know they're not equal to the situation, and they do it anyway." He thought about that. "That sounds about right," he said. 2 weeks later, Valdus 7 monitoring flag sent a routine update to Voss's terminal. Case status unchanged. 47-day review queue intact. No priority escalation. He filed the acknowledgement receipt, which took approximately 4 seconds, and returned to the stack of intake forms on his desk, which was never smaller than it had been when he'd started and never would be. Outside the checkpoint, the refugee flow continued. 8 to 12,000 crossings a day, maybe more now. The Conclave had expanded the mandate's enforcement zone, and that expansion was pushing more people toward the boundary faster than the processing system could handle. Voss filed intake forms. He cross-referenced documentation. He flagged anomalies through the correct channels and routed cases through the obscure procedural provisions that most officers didn't know existed, because most officers hadn't spent 11 months learning the system's internal topography. The way a person learns the corridors of a building they've lived in long enough that they know which floors creak and where the drafts come in. He was a man who sat at a desk and stamped forms in a war zone. He was also the only person who knew about the maintenance schedule of the biometric scanner, and the 4-minute gap in the shift change monitoring window, and the 48-hour ledger delay in EDP-7 forms, and approximately 67 other specific structural gaps in a system that had been built for 2,000 crossings a day, and was now handling 6 times that, a system that was bending in very specific places that he knew. He was not a soldier in any meaningful military sense. He was not a hero in any recognizable narrative sense. He had done one thing on one night, with the tools and the knowledge and the time that were available to him, and the thing he'd done was, technically speaking, nothing more than the careful, correct, thorough filing of a form. The stone with the Ironblood word on it sat on the corner of his desk. He'd put it there because leaving it in his pocket felt wrong, like keeping something in the dark that was supposed to be in the light. Commander Enoch passed his desk that afternoon at the usual irregular interval, stopped, looked at the stone with compound eyes that Voss still couldn't read, in a face that told him nothing. "Decorated your workspace," Enoch said. "Found it in the condemned sector," Voss said. "Seemed like it belonged somewhere visible." Enoch looked at the stone for another moment. Then Enoch looked at him. "Your documentation," Enoch said, "is always correct." It was exactly what Preth had said. It was probably not a coincidence. "I try to be thorough," Voss said. Enoch made a sound that Voss had never heard from a Drath before. Low, resonant, somewhere between acknowledgement and something else he didn't have a name for. Then Enoch walked on, following the usual irregular route, and Voss returned to his stack of forms. The stone sat on the corner of his desk. Witness? The thing a person does when they know they're not equal to the situation, and they do it anyway. Outside, through the checkpoint's narrow windows, the refugee column stretched toward the boundary in both directions, as far as he could see. Somewhere on the other side of the buffer zone, in a Threnny registry room that smelled of records and low-grade antiseptic, a 9-year-old girl with gold eyes was eating a meal and sleeping without waking every hour and was alive. The intake form on his desk was waiting. He picked up his stamp and got back to work.